Thank you again for taking the time to sit with us. It would be really interesting to get your perspective on what you think the distinction is between having limits to how much is allowed to be donated to political campaigns versus how much is allowed to be spent by political campaigns. The former is usually how it's thought of in the US context, and the latter is more relevant to India because our limits are on election spending more than election donations. So to what extent do you think these are related issues, and to what extent do you think solving one addresses the other?
Well, so they're related, I think, because in some respect they're trying to get to the same question, which is to reduce the opportunities for corruption. One by trying to reduce the cost of campaigns, and the other by trying to limit the size of contributions that can go to campaigns. I'll admit I'm not a huge fan of either approach. I think that the limiting of spending is after an objective that can't be met. So it's after an objective, at least in the United States context. I can't speak to the reasons for having the policy in India. But in the United States context, the interest was both to try to reduce corruption, but also with an idea that you were going to reduce the cost of campaigns in the aggregate. And the problem with that idea, again, at least in the U.S. context, where first of all we're constitutionally not able to limit spending in the aggregate or completely limit spending. There are always going to be ways that you can drive money into the political process around the limits. And the second is the campaigns cost money. It costs money to reach out to voters. It costs money to communicate. It costs money to organize your campaign, organize your staff. And there's an incentive to spend enough money on your campaign to win equal to the expected results. And the expected results are not necessarily corrupt results. It's not necessarily that you're going to get a corresponding economic benefit, but you might get some other benefits. You might have enough interest in the policy, be it general social policy, that would come out of it that you want to affect that election. And if you set a limit that is sort of well below optimal as to what it would really cost to run the election, then there's always going to be an incentive to skirt it, and there's always going to be often going to be the opportunity to skirt it. So I just don't think it's a terribly effective policy in the aggregate. So it's an interesting question about what the limits, what if you were to have limits, what should they be? So American commentators use a variety of different versions of the same idea, which is, we spend more money on bubblegum advertising than we do on politics. We spend more money on potato chips or whatever. And their argument is, we should be spending more money on politics because it's more important than potato chips and bubblegum. So I think any construct that tries to say, this is what it should cost and no more, runs into an argument. This is, you actually want these things to be competitive. To the extent that money really is related to the ability to get ideas out into the public domain, which is often hard to argue, at least in the American context, because the context of these, or the content of advertising is often so negative and content-less. But nonetheless, if you're willing to assume the best and say that this money is actually getting ideas into the public sphere, you want more ideas in the public sphere. So in general, as I said, I'm not in favor of it, and I don't know how you would set the limit in terms of what should be the maximum.
It would also be great to get your perspective on why you think all corporations should not be thought of in the same way legally. And you've said in the past that some corporations are more suited to be thought of as legal persons than others. Why do you think that is?
So, this comes up in the United States in the context of a decision called Citizens United versus FEC, which addressed a law that prohibited corporations from engaging in political activity directly. This is not dealing with campaign contributions. It's just their ability to engage in activities that might affect the campaign, and specifically was something that mentioned the candidate by name. And the court struck down those limits, and it's been the response was to say, well, the court is saying that corporations are people. And it's not only that case, there's a variety of other cases in the US that deal with corporate rights, and it's a complicated area. But the court made a number of assertions about corporations that are not accurate. So that is to say, corporations were being treated as a class, that all corporations were prohibited. And the court was essentially saying, but corporations are they're just voluntary associations of people. And if you don't like what it's doing, then you can sell your shares, and there you go. You can unvolunteer. And the fact is, there are many corporations that are like that. Many advocacy groups are like that. They are actually voluntary associations. People come together to contribute their time or their resources to advocate for something. Public corporations tend not to be that. They tend not to be voluntary. So if you're the beneficiary of a pension, for instance, you may have no control. You may be the ultimate owner of shares in a corporation, but have no control over whether the shares are bought and sold. So in your name, ostensibly, a corporation might act politically, but you can't control it. And often, it's not necessarily voluntary, and they're not necessarily people either. So corporate shareholders can be trusts, they can be, they can be foreign shareholders, they can be insurance companies or pensions or other forms of institutions. So you might not actually get to a person. If there's a trust for a land bank of trees, and that has an endowment, and the endowment invests in a corporation. So does the tree now speak? So I think you can distinguish between different types of corporate entity, different types of associations, in a way that the court didn't have to. The U.S. Supreme Court didn't have to in that case, but you can if you present a more refined argument about what those rights really are and who they pertain to.
What would you say to people who contend that limiting donor contributions is tantamount to limiting freedom of speech? Because on the one hand, if you think of donor contributions as being equivalent to freedom of speech, and you allow speech to be expressed in terms of dollar contributions, then you are unfairly limiting the speech of the poor. But on the other hand, all rights have this kind of trade-off. Even freedom of speech is not absolute, because then you could be, say, hurting the religious sentiments of another. How can we think about this balance?
So I think, first of all, you're absolutely right that there are no absolute rights. In the U.S., you don't even have the absolute right to life, since the death penalty exists. There's another Supreme Court case in the United States called Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976, which took on and addressed a series of campaign finance regulations, very strict regulations that were passed after the Watergate scandal. And this is a case that is widely summarized as the money equals speech case. That what the court said was that the ability to spend your money was closely enough related to your right to speak that we shouldn't regulate it, or if we're going to regulate it, we have to be really, really careful. We should treat it as carefully as we treat the right to speak directly. And the court differentiated between the ability to speak on your own and to do something on your own and to spend your own money for your own speech, and the ability to contribute money to a candidate, and suggested that the ability to contribute has a lesser protection, because really what you're doing is you're associating yourself with the candidate. You're not speaking more just by giving more, and therefore it could be regulated in a different way than spending money on your own. And I think the court was basically right in that. That the ability to amplify your own speech should enjoy a greater protection than the ability to contribute to a candidate directly, where particularly the argument is when you're engaging in a transaction with a candidate, the possibility for corruption is more apparent. The rules, so if I wanted to bribe you, bribe you with money, that would also be speech under the same argument. But we say, well, we can stop that because there's a sufficient interest to say, we can eliminate that type of transaction. Proving bribery is really hard. And historically, it's actually, it's a very difficult crime to prove because you have to prove intent, you have to show the transaction existed. And so one of the reasons that you create campaign contribution limits is as a prophylactic against that against that possibility. So because it would be so hard to prove after the fact, you simply eliminate the transaction in the whole, and that's okay. I think that constitutionally in the U.S., I think theoretically, I think all of that's right. All of that said, I don't think contribution limits themselves are terribly effective if there are so many other ways for money to flow into the system. And so it's not, as a policy matter, I'm not sure it's the most effective way to think about how to solve campaign finance problems.
Could you share an instance or two of when you think large donor influence has resulted in poor policy making?
So there's a narrow example, of interest to a small group of people, which is one of the reasons why the money has some influence. So there's a tax policy in the United States that. And by the way, there are hundreds of examples, and ask a different person, you get a different answer. But telecommunications and energy and greenhouse gases, they're all places where you can make an argument that campaign contributions play a role in policy. But just to the specific example, there's a tax policy that capital gains or gains on investments are taxed at a different rate than taxes than income. So 15% versus 35 or 40%. There's a second part of that policy that says that managers of hedge funds and private equity funds, when they're compensated by the fund that they manage, that those get treated as capital gains as opposed to ordinary income. It's an incredibly valuable, when you're talking about funds that are in the billions of dollars, fees that are in the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, it's an incredibly valuable advantage. As long as both Republicans and Democrats raise a substantial portion of the funds that they use to run for election, both at the party and at the candidate level, in New York, where these industries are central, and the donors for both campaigns are centered around those professionals in the finance community, neither party is going to make that change in the law a part of their program. And so, again, a minor example, but sufficiently specific and sufficiently easy to tie to a specific community of donors on both the Democratic and the Republican side, that I think you can argue that effect quite well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So from what you know about the campaign finance regime in India, do you have recommendations of what we can do to make our system better?
So what I understand about the Indian system is that you have relatively low limits on what can be spent on campaigns at the candidate level. It would seem like quite a small amount of money to be able to effectively have a campaign. And that as a result, that limit is widely ignored in practice. There are lots of other ways to see money go, some of them legal and some of them maybe less legal. But that by and large, it's been argued to me that virtually everybody who's running in these seats is in some way or another not abiding by those limits. That doesn't seem like a very good outcome, to have everybody who's in the parliament essentially be a rule breaker or a law breaker before they even get there. So a better solution might be, and it's not, I want to be respectful of making recommendations, but a better solution might be not to bother with those limits, but to have complete transparency over what's contributed and what's spent, so that the candidates can spend what they need to spend to run their elections, but everyone can see where the money's coming from. Right now, it would appear that no one can see where the money's coming. You don't know how much. You don't know where it's coming from, and it's breaking the rules for it to be spent in the first place. Seems like a bad outcome for everybody. So thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.